Have you ever felt a sudden pull, like something was trying to stop you? Picture this, you're about to leave the house, keys in hand, coat already on, but something tells you, wait. You don't know why. Just a quiet feeling, a soft pressure in your chest, a voice without sound. What if that moment was not random? What if the last thing you felt was not fear, but a message? This is not just a question, it's a real story. A true moment when something invisible whispered a warning and someone listened. Today's story begins with silence. A winter morning in Portugal, a man sitting alone with his memories, and a locket that still smells like rosemary. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to feel, that quiet tug in the soul, would become the difference between life and irreversible loss. These are not just tales, they are testimonies of dreams that came before disaster, of voices that echoed through prayer, of footsteps that paused just in time. In this episode, you'll witness one of many real stories of angel signs before tragedy, a subtle miracle, wrapped in grief, mystery, and something that feels like grace. Before the worst happens, sometimes the universe sends a sign. If you believe in guardian angels, fate, or simply want to hear real stories of life-changing moments, subscribe to Saved by a Sign and stay with us for today's powerful story, The Last Morning. The afternoon light had dimmed to a soft gold, casting long, slow-moving shadows across Joaquim's modest living room. Outside, the sun slid behind the hills of Porto, and the city exhaled into evening. Slow cars on cobbled streets, the faint clinking of teacups from a neighbor's window, the smell of old wood warming under a heater's breath. Inside, time moved differently. Joaquim sat in his late wife's favorite chair, his hands folded in silence, the cushion still bearing the gentle dip from the years Clara spent curled there with her knitting or a book of poems. He hadn't touched it since she passed. It was the last place she sat before everything stopped. He had turned on the old radio, not out of habit, but perhaps out of hope. The dial, yellowed with age, crackled before settling on a station he didn't recognize. A classical channel, he guessed. But the music that played didn't feel familiar. It was a piano piece, delicate and slow, the notes drifting like dust in a sunbeam. There was hesitation in the melody, as if the pianist wasn't sure of each note, or as if they were remembering it from a dream, the kind of music you don't just hear, but feel. Then it happened. The music cut out, not faded, not paused, cut sharply without warning, leaving the room in a silence that rang louder than sound. And in that silence he heard something impossible, a whisper, soft, near, female, not yet. Two words, carried on nothing but stillness, so clear, so close, they didn't echo. They pressed gently against his ear, like breath on skin. Joaquim froze. He turned, his head slowly toward the empty hallway behind him, where the last of the sun painted the floor in amber. No one, no shadow, no breeze. Not a single board creaked beneath his feet. The room had returned to silence, but it wasn't the same. It felt thinner somehow, as if something sacred had just passed through and was now watching from just beyond the veil. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the strange, steady feeling that someone had truly been there, and meant every word. Not yet. He whispered it aloud, unsure if saying it would break the spell or make it real. He stood up slowly, his eyes searching the corners of the room for something he didn't have a name for. Maybe Clara's perfume, still faint on the back of a cushion. Maybe just a draft from the cracked window behind the curtain. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't either. Because that voice didn't feel like a memory. It didn't feel like longing or grief or imagination. It felt like a warning, a kind one, gentle but certain. Joaquim sat back down, this time in his own chair. He placed his hand over his chest, over the locket he now wore every day, Clara's locket, which he hadn't taken off since the funeral. And for a moment, he simply breathed, eyes closed, listening. There was nothing more, no voice, no music. But the moment had changed something, as if the world had briefly pulled back the curtain and let him see behind it. Later that evening, his neighbor Sophia, a kind widow who often brought him soup or fruit, called in a panic. Her brother had passed by the local bus stop earlier and noticed something strange, a brake line rupture on the number 5 bus, the very one Joaquim used to take every Thursday to visit the cemetery. The bus had been pulled from the route just minutes before its departure. Mechanics said if it had left on time, the brakes would have failed halfway down the steep road toward the riverside. That day had been Thursday, and for the first time in many months, Joaquim hadn't gone. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't been tired. He had simply stayed. He didn't understand why. He just remembered sitting in the garden that morning and feeling something deep in his chest, a quiet pressure like hands on his shoulders holding him in place. That and the whisper that came later. Was it Clara? Was it something else? He didn't know, but from that day on, he began to pay closer attention to the silences, to the dreams, to the pauses in his own rhythm that didn't make sense until they did. And every now and then, when the sky turns gold and the old piano on the radio plays something fragile and strange, Joaquim closes his eyes and listens. Not for music, but for the sound that shouldn't be there. The voice that comes not to frighten, but to guide, because some signs don't come with lightning or visions. Some come softly, quietly, and only those who are still enough can hear them. Was it coincidence, destiny, or an angel watching over him? He may never know, but one thing is certain, he was meant to stay home that day, and someone or something made sure he did. That night, the house seemed quieter than usual, the kind of silence that hums behind the walls when you're the only one left listening. Rain tapped gently on the window panes, and the cold crept under the doors, like a memory trying to find its way back in. Joaquim had fallen asleep, clutching Clara's locket, the chain wrapped loosely around his fingers. He didn't remember drifting off. Only that one moment he was staring at the ceiling in the dark, and the next he was somewhere else entirely. In the dream, he stood in front of the old village clock tower, the same tower where he had once gone down on one knee, heart trembling, to ask Clara to spend the rest of her life with him. The square had been filled with music back then, violins, bells, laughter. But now it was empty. Still. The stones beneath his feet felt colder than they should, and the sky above held no stars. Just a dull, endless grey, like the world was holding its breath. He looked up. The hands of the clock began to move, slowly at first, then faster, spinning, whirling, like time itself had broken loose. His heart raced as he watched them blur past the hours. 10, 11, midnight, 2, until suddenly they slammed to a stop. 3:17. The chimes never rang. The wind never blew. Everything froze. And then, from the top of the tower, from a window that hadn't existed before, a white dove appeared. Pure, still, glowing faintly against the stone. It flew down toward him, circling once above his head, and then vanished into a sudden burst of white light so bright it washed away the sky, the tower, the world itself. Joaquim gasped awake. He sat up, hands clutching the blanket like a man yanked from the edge of something he couldn't see. The room was dark, but different, like the shadows had shifted in his absence. The air felt thick, his chest weighted by something unseen. His eyes darted to the clock on the bedside table. 3:17 a.m. exactly. No more, no less. He didn't move. Couldn't. His body remained frozen, his breath shallow, while his mind tried to climb back from wherever it had been. The dream still echoed inside him, not like a memory, but like a warning, the kind that doesn't come with words, only with symbols and silence. He sat there for a long time, staring at the clock, the digits glowing faint green in the dark, and then he whispered, barely louder than a breath, "Was that you, Clara?" There was no reply, only the sound of rain and the quiet ticking of the bedside clock, which now seemed louder than it should have. But something inside him knew that dream hadn't come from nowhere. The spinning hands, the number, the dove, the light. It meant something. He remembered what she used to say back when they were young and believed in signs more than plans. If heaven ever needs to speak, it won't shout, it'll whisper. That night, Joaquim didn't sleep again. He stayed awake, heart thudding like a second heartbeat, watching the clock, waiting for the silence to speak again. Because some signs come in the shape of dreams, and some dreams leave behind more than just questions. They leave instructions. Joaquim didn't tell a soul about the dream, not the neighbor who brought him bread each morning, not Father Miguel, his closest friend from the chapel, the only one who might have understood. Some things felt too delicate to speak aloud, like breath on glass, like a thread you don't dare pull for fear the whole thing might unravel. But the signs didn't stop. They deepened. Each night that week, Joaquim would lie in bed with the covers drawn to his chest, the locket pressed between his fingers. He wouldn't even realize he'd fallen asleep. It was always the same. One moment, the hum of the city outside. The next, he was somewhere between dreams and memory. And there it was again, the locket, swinging back and forth, like a pendulum suspended. In a dark room without walls, tick-tock, tick-tock. He couldn't see where it was hanging from, only the soft sway, hypnotic, endless. And each time it swung, he felt it deeper in his chest, not like a sound, but like a rhythm inside his own body, a clock counting down. And just before he would open his eyes, just as the final image began to fade, he'd hear it. Not yet. The same voice. The same gentle certainty, never louder, never closer, just there. Each time it happened, Joaquim would sit up drenched in quiet tension, the room around him untouched, unchanged. Yet something in the air felt thinner, like it had been passed through, like something had watched him sleep. He began to keep the curtains drawn, unsure why, except that the shadows felt heavier than before. The ticking of his old kitchen clock grew unbearable, echoing louder than it had in years. He would walk past the hallway mirror and pause, sensing something in the reflection that wasn't him, not fully. He wasn't afraid, not in the way fear usually feels. It was something more complex, more sacred, a mixture of awe and anticipation. As if the world had taken a breath but refused to release it, as if time itself had paused on the edge of something he couldn't name. He tried to distract himself with music, with prayer, even with cleaning the same drawer 3 days in a row. But every time he closed his eyes, the locket returned. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Not yet. It wasn't just a phrase anymore. It was a presence. A force wrapped in patience, a delay that felt divine. Joaquim began to wonder if these weren't just memories of Clara, but something far greater, something using her memory as a doorway or a vessel to reach him. And what was it postponing? What was the moment that hadn't arrived yet? Each day felt heavier, more expectant, as though he was walking toward something unseen, and every sign was keeping him from stepping too soon. And still, he told no one. Not because he didn't trust them, but because this was no longer something to explain. It was something to carry, quietly, like a flame cupped in both hands, too sacred for wind or words, because when the voice returns night after night, not with fear, but with warning, when the symbols refuse to fade, when time seems to echo around you, you begin to understand you're not just being haunted by the past, you're being held back by something greater, protected. By what? By whom? He didn't know. But whatever it wasn't finished yet, and neither was he. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the kind where the rain doesn't fall. It lingers, floating gently through the air like a soft veil drawn over the town. The sky outside had turned a shade of pale ash, and the scent of wet stones seeped through the cracks in the kitchen window. Joaquim stood at the sink, rinsing a single teacup. The water ran warm over his hands, and he watched it trace tiny streams across porcelain, the way Clara used to, slowly, with intention. A soft melody from the radio played in the background. It might have been Chopin, or maybe something nameless, the kind of music that disappears before you realize it's ended, and then everything paused. Joaquim blinked, confused, not by something he saw, but by what he no longer felt. His chest had gone strangely light, his breath slow, detached, as if he were floating just above himself. No pain, no panic, only stillness. He reached out instinctively, one hand bracing the edge of the counter, but the surface seemed to pull away before he could touch it. His knees gave way. The floor rushed up toward him, but even that felt far, soft, like falling through smoke. And then everything vanished. The kitchen, the rain, the sounds of the world, gone. Only darkness remained, but it wasn't the cold kind. It didn't press or suffocate. It was vast, open, like standing in the middle of a great cathedral with no walls and no roof, only silence. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or if this was the end, until a voice, not like before. This time it was clearer, closer, so real it felt as though it lived inside his own breath. It didn't shout, it didn't rush. It spoke with the kind of tenderness only love can carry, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket in winter or the weight of a familiar hand on your back. Listen to me. A pause. Breathe. And then, with absolute certainty, it is not your hour. The words didn't echo, they anchored, and suddenly he was falling the other way, backward, through layers of sound and light and memory. He felt warmth return to his chest, a sharp pull behind his ribs, a gasp, and then air. The kitchen reappeared in fragments, the chipped tile, the radio static, the smell of rain on earth. He was on the floor, one hand curled against his chest, the other reaching toward something he could no longer see. His breath came in short, shallow waves. But he was there, alive, and in that fragile moment, between collapse and consciousness, Joaquim knew, without question, that he had stood at the edge of something final, and had been called back, not by chance, not by medicine, but by something that knew him. He didn't try to explain it, he didn't run to call anyone, he just lay there listening to the ticking of the kitchen clock, each second louder than it had ever been before, and in his mind the words repeated like a prayer, "It is not your hour." Because something had broken the silence, something had spoken, and someone, had refused to let go. He didn't remember being lifted, only the feeling of no longer touching the earth. Joaquim floated, not like a leaf in the wind, but as if cradled in something invisible. A softness, a warmth, not free-falling, not rising, just being held, gently, securely. There was no light, no sound, no shape. But he wasn't afraid. It wasn't emptiness. It was presence, thick, silent, knowing, though his eyes were closed, or maybe they didn't exist in this place. Joaquim felt everything, the sensation of hands, not rough or grasping, but warm, steady, resting against his chest. A pressure near his heart that pulsed in rhythm with something deeper than blood. And across his forehead, Something delicate brushed once, twice, like feathers or breath. He wanted to cry, though there were no tears, only the strange ache of awe. He wasn't alone. He knew that now with a certainty deeper than thought. And then the voice returned. It didn't come from around him. It came through him, spoken not into the air, but into the soul. Clara isn't waiting. A pause, like a hand resting in silence. She's watching. The words held no sadness, only love, and something else, something firm, like instruction, a quiet urgency. You must finish the music. Joaquim didn't understand. Not fully, but somewhere deep inside, something stirred. The music. The unfinished song he had started writing after Clara's funeral. The one he never completed. He hadn't touched it in months, couldn't. The notes felt too heavy, the piano too loud, the silence unbearable. But now it felt like a door opening, as if the melody was more than memory, as if it was his bridge back. Suddenly, a jolt, not pain, but pressure, a pulling sensation, sharp and sudden, like the snapping of a thread that had stretched too far. The warmth pressed deeper into his chest. And then, a sound, a breath, not his, not yet. A deep, rushing inhale poured into him like light into a dark room. It filled every hollow space, every cold corner, as if the world had returned and brought him back with it. He gasped. Air surged through his lungs. The kitchen ceiling reappeared above him. The hum of the refrigerator, the patter of rain. His body heavy now, solid, real. He lay there for several seconds, stunned, trembling, alive. Between two worlds, something had reached him, had held him, had spoken to him in the quiet place beyond time. And in that space, he had heard the truth. Clara wasn't calling him home. She was asking him to stay, because some stories aren't finished, some music must still be played, and some signs, though soft as a whisper, carry the weight of a divine command. White light, not the blinding kind, but soft, washed over everything like morning mist. Joaquim opened his eyes slowly, as if rising from deep water. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, sterile. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mixed with something metallic and clean. He blinked, adjusting. His chest ached, not sharply but with the weight of return, of breath pulled back from the edge. A voice pierced the stillness. It trembled, young, surprised. "You were gone for nearly 2 minutes," the nurse whispered, eyes wide, her hand still pressed to his wrist. "We had no pulse." Machines beeped softly around him now, small reminders of a world he thought he might not see again. But Joaquim didn't hear her. Not really. His eyes were open, but his mind was elsewhere, still floating between the dark and the light, where warmth had wrapped around him like a second skin. And then the tears came, not loud, not panicked. They spilled slowly, silently, tracking down the lines of his face like rain down an old window pane. He wasn't crying from fear or from the shock of being pulled back. He was crying because he had felt it, not imagined, not dreamed. Felt it, that presence, the hands on his chest, the voice that had called him back, the brush across his forehead like wings or love. He had been held, not by machines, not by people, by something he didn't have the language to explain, something older, wiser, still watching. He turned his head slowly, the tears still falling, and whispered, more to the space around him than to the nurse. She was there. The nurse leaned in. Who? But Joaquim just closed his eyes, a small, grateful smile forming through the ache in his ribs, because he didn't need to explain. Not now. Not yet. He had crossed the threshold between two worlds, And something, had reached across the veil to pull him back. Not because he asked, but because he was meant to stay. And in that moment, lying under the glow of hospital lights, the monitors clicking back into rhythm, Joaquim understood something more than words could say. Sometimes, when your heart stops, what starts again is something entirely new. Not just life, but purpose. Because when you're truly held by something greater, you don't come back the same. The rain had stopped by the time Joaquim came home. The sky above Porto was washed clean, the clouds parted just enough to let in a soft, forgiving light. The house, unchanged in its silence, seemed to breathe again as he stepped through the door, slower, warmer, as if waiting. He moved carefully, his body still sore, but not from pain. More like the ache that follows a long sleep or a long journey home. The air inside was heavy with the scent of rosemary and wood polish, and the faint creak of the floorboards under his feet was like the whisper of a familiar voice. Each step was memory. He made his way to the bedroom where Clara's locket sat on the nightstand, always within reach, always untouched. He picked it up with trembling fingers, brushing the chain across his thumb. For nearly a year, it had been a symbol of stillness, grief, love paused in time. But now, something inside him felt ready. He pressed the tiny clasp and opened it. The photo, the one of her sitting by the lake with a book in her lap, sunlight in her eyes, was gone. In its place was something he didn't recognize. A folded scrap of paper, aged and fragile, pressed delicately into the space behind the frame. He hadn't placed it there. He was sure. His breath caught as he unfolded it slowly, hands shaking, afraid the paper might vanish if he blinked. The handwriting was Clara's. He knew the curves of each letter, the way she looped her F's like music notes. It was her hand, no doubt, and it read, "If the music ever stops, remember, the silence is just the space before the next note." Joaquim dropped his head, the paper pressed to his chest as the tears returned, deep, cleansing, unstoppable. He wept not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that she knew that even from beyond, wherever she now stood, Clara had left him something, not just comfort, a message, a sign. He didn't ask how the note got there, whether it had always been hidden or if it had arrived. Some questions aren't meant for answers, some are meant to be felt. Still holding the note, he walked, slowly, reverently, to the small room where the piano sat covered in a white sheet. Dust settled in the corners like time gone still. He hadn't touched it since the day of the funeral, but now, with careful hands, he pulled the sheet away. The wood shone dimly beneath, and the keys, though a bit out of tune, welcomed him like old friends. He sat down without hesitation. No warm-up, no preparation, just presence. He placed the locket on the music stand, unfolded the paper once more, and rested it gently beside it. Then he played. The melody didn't come from his mind. It rose from someplace else, deeper, older. It was slow at first, fragile, each note walking like a child, just learning to trust their steps. But with each chord, something opened. Not just in the music, in him. He wasn't playing for Clara. He was playing with her, because in that moment, between the notes and the silence, Joaquim finally understood. The song wasn't over. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to begin again. The days that followed passed not in silence, but in stillness, the kind that listens. Joaquim no longer feared the quiet. He welcomed it. He sat with it, let it breathe beside him. It was no longer a reminder of loss, but a space where something invisible moved, where whispers found their way into music. He began to write again, but not as before. This wasn't the careful, structured composition of a man trying to impress or distract himself. This was surrender. Each note came gently, as if placed into his hands by something unseen. He didn't chase the melody. He received it. He would wake some nights and hear the faint echo of a phrase before his eyes had opened. Sometimes in dreams, the piano played itself, and he simply listened. The piece revealed itself slowly. He called it "Not Yet." It began with a single aching chord, soft, unresolved, and unfolded like a breath held too long. There were pauses, spaces between the notes that felt like suspended prayer. It moved like memory and like return. At the end, just as the final chord faded into silence, came a sound. A single bird call, high, clear, fragile, the sound of a dove. He never told anyone where he found that final note, only that he had heard it once before, at the top of a clock tower, just before the light took everything. The village chapel was nearly full. On the day he first played it, word had quietly spread that Joaquim Ribeiro, the old music teacher who hadn't touched a piano in almost a year, was ready. The pews were filled with neighbors, old students, friends who had watched him slowly fade since Clara's passing. And Father Miguel stood at the back of the sanctuary, his hands folded, eyes already damp before the first note was played. Joaquim sat in silence for a moment before his fingers touched the keys. He looked up toward the altar, not for approval, not for courage, but for presence. Then he began, and as the final dove's song echoed through the chapel, the stillness that followed was so complete it felt sacred. No one moved, not even the air. When it was over, Joaquim stayed seated, his hands resting quietly on the keys. The locket, now always with him, shimmered faintly in the light from the stained glass windows. Father Miguel approached slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Joaquim," he paused. Then, with the quiet certainty of someone who had felt heaven brush the edge of earth, he said, "I believe this music was meant to bring you back." And Joaquim nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. Because it had. Not just from the stillness, not just from the silence, but from the space between the two, where something holy had whispered, "Not yet." Years passed, but some melodies don't fade. They grow quieter, deeper, like rivers running beneath the skin. Joaquim aged gently, like old wood that holds warmth in its grain. His hair thinned, his steps slowed, but each year on Clara's birthday he returned to the same place, the garden behind their home. A piano now sat there, sheltered beneath an awning, its keys worn with memory and morning dew. He played only one piece on that day, the same piece, always the same. Not yet. And even after all this time, the music still moved through him like prayer. Not rehearsed, not remembered, received. That morning the air was perfectly still. The leaves didn't stir. The sky was soft and pale, the color of linen. He played the final chord with trembling hands, holding it for a breath longer than usual, as if listening for something he could no longer name. Then he stood. He turned to leave, but paused. There, resting on the wooden bench beside the piano, was a single white feather. No breeze had carried it. No birds circled overhead. The sky remained empty, silent, watching. He didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. He simply smiled. That quiet, knowing smile of someone who has walked the edge of the veil and returned with something weightless in his chest. And he whispered, barely louder than the wind, "Not yet." No one else saw the feather that day. No one heard the whisper he carried back into the house, but that moment, simple, unspoken, stayed with him. And in the hush that followed, something sacred settled over the garden, as if time itself had bowed in reverence. because there are signs that shout and signs that sing. But the ones that truly change us, they whisper. They drift into our lives when we're quiet enough to notice. A dream at 3:17, a voice in the silence, a feather resting on a bench after the last note has been played. And maybe they come from within. Or maybe they come from somewhere we'll never fully understand. A place where time bends, where love doesn't end, where guardian angels wait. Not to call us home, but to remind us that we still have something left to do. Something to say, something to heal, a song to finish, and perhaps a life to truly begin. Have you ever experienced a sign like this? Do you believe it was just coincidence or something divine? What would you have done if this happened to you? Do you think angels are trying to guide us even when we don't notice? Here we don't give answers. We make space for the questions, the kind that live in your chest long after the story ends. Because somewhere between coincidence and faith, between silence and song, that's where the real miracles happen. If this story touched your heart, don't let these signs go unnoticed. Subscribe to Saved by a Sign and stay with us to hear more real stories of faith, mystery, and the moments when life whispers, just in time. Thank you for staying until the end. But remember, there are stories that aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be felt. We'll see you in the next one, if you're still listening.